We have chosen with deliberate intent to bestow upon this work the title of a history, a designation we believe it rightly deserves. It is not a mere chronicle of a single life, nor is it an apology for one, as is so often the fashionable custom of our age. No, our ambition soars higher. We aspire to emulate the grand method of those authors who lay bare the seismic revolutions of entire nations rather than toiling in the footsteps of the painstaking and voluminous historian. This common historian, enslaved to the rigid chronology of his series, feels compelled to dedicate as many reams of paper to the tedious detail of barren months and uneventful years, periods where humanity slumbered in quiet obscurity, as he does to those brilliant, notable eras. When the greatest dramas of the human spirit have been enacted upon the world's stage, such tedious histories in their essence bear a striking resemblance to a common newspaper, which must by its very nature fill the same allotted space with the same number of words, regardless of whether there is any true news to report. The ink must flow, the press must turn, even if the content is but empty air. They can likewise be compared to a lumbering stagecoach, which doggedly completes its predetermined route, day after day, its journey unchanged, whether it carries a full complement of vibrant passengers or rattles along hollow and empty a cumbering ghost of its purpose. The writer of such a history seems to labor under the misapprehension that he is obliged to keep pace with time itself, acting as its mere amanuensis, its secretary, and like his slow-footed master, he trudges with equal lethargy through centuries of monkish dullness, when the very world appeared to be locked in a deep and dreamless sleep, as he does through that bright, bustling and busy age so nobly distinguished by the excellent Latin poet, an age which he describes with thundering verse, ad confligendum venientibus undique poenis, omnia cum belli trepido concussa tumultu, horrida contremoere sub altis aeteres auris, indubioque fuit sub outrorum regna cadendum, omnibus humanis esset terraque marique, for which we can offer our readers no more adequate a translation than that provided by Mr. Creech, whose words capture the tumult. When dreadful Carthage frighted Rome with arms, and all the world was shook with fierce alarms, whilst undecided yet which part should fall, which nation rise, the glorious Lord of all. Now it is our stated and unwavering purpose in the pages that will follow to pursue a path entirely contrary to the common method. When a truly extraordinary scene presents itself upon the tapestry of our narrative, as we trust, with hopeful anticipation, will often be the case, we shall spare no pains and no paper to unfold it in its full magnificent scope for our reader. We shall dissect its nuances, illuminate its characters, and bathe in the drama of its moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the art of storytelling, be sure to subscribe for more content and leave a comment with your thoughts below. However, if whole years should pass in a barren procession producing nothing worthy of his notice, we shall not tremble at the prospect of a chasm in our history. We shall not fill the void with the dust of insignificance. Instead, we shall nimbly hasten on to matters of genuine consequence, leaving such empty periods of time entirely unobserved as one would pass by a barren field without a second glance. These uneventful epochs are in the grand design to be considered as the inevitable blanks in the colossal lottery of time. We therefore, who have taken upon ourselves the solemn duty of registering the outcomes of this lottery, shall imitate the practice of those sagacious persons who deal in the tickets drawn at Guildhall. They never trouble the public with the countless worthless blanks they dispose of. Their silence on the matter is a courtesy. But when a great prize is drawn, a fortune won, a destiny altered, the newspapers are immediately filled with the clamor of it. The world is promptly and loudly informed at whose office the winning ticket was sold. Indeed, it is common for 2 or 3 different offices to lay claim to the honor, a competition of credibility. By this, I suppose the adventurers are given to understand that certain brokers are privy to the secrets of Dame Fortune herself, and are in fact members of her most private cabinet council. My reader therefore must not be surprised if in the course of this work he shall discover some chapters that are remarkably brief, and others that stretch out with the luxury of detail. Some may contain the compressed events of a single fateful day, while others might encompass the slow procession of years. If you appreciate this unique approach to history, show your support with a like and share. This with a fellow book lover. In short, my history may sometimes seem to stand perfectly still, a frozen pond, and at other times to fly with the speed of a falcon, for all of which I shall not consider myself accountable to any court of critical jurisdiction whatsoever. For as I am in reality the founder of a new province of writing, I am thereby at liberty to make and decree whatever laws I please within its borders. And these laws my readers, whom I consider as my cherished subjects, are bound to believe in and to obey. To ensure that they may readily and cheerfully comply, I do hereby assure them that I shall principally regard their ease and advantage in all such institutions, for I do not like a giuor divino tyrant. Imagine that they are my slaves, or my mere commodity. I am indeed set over them for their own good only, and was created for their use, and not they for mine. Nor do I doubt, while I make their interest the great and guiding rule of my writings, that they will unanimously concur in supporting my dignity, and in rendering me all the honor I shall deserve or desire. A period of 8 months, a tranquil stretch of time, marked by the settled rhythms of married life at the Allworthy estate, had slipped quietly by since the celebration of the nuptials between Captain Blifil and the esteemed Miss Bridget Allworthy. The lady herself was a figure of renowned virtue, her great beauty and merit complemented by a substantial fortune making the match a subject of much satisfaction in the county. Then, an event of sudden drama pierced this calm, seized by a violent and unexpected fright, the details of which were whispered but never fully confirmed. Mrs. Bridget Blifil was delivered of a fine, healthy boy. The child, to all outward appearances, was perfectly formed, a rosy-cheeked infant with a strong cry. Yet the midwife, a woman whose eyes had witnessed the secrets of 1,000 birth chambers, murmured a curious aside to the attending physician. She judged the babe to have arrived a full month before its natural time. This blessed event, the arrival of a direct heir from his beloved sister, filled Mr. Allworthy's benevolent heart with a deep and resonant joy. Yet this new familial affection did not dislodge or alienate the tender fondness he had cultivated for the little foundling. He had served as the boy's godfather, had bestowed upon him the honor of his own Christian name, Thomas, and had adhered to a near sacred ritual of visiting the child's nursery at least once each day, his presence a constant and warming sun in the infant's small world. In a gesture emblematic of his boundless generosity, Mr. Allworthy proposed to his sister that if it were agreeable to her, this newborn heir should be bred up together, with little Tommy, the two boys sharing a nursery, a tutor, and the comradeship of childhood. To this she consented, though a subtle, almost imperceptible reluctance tightened the corners of her mouth. Her compliance was born from a profound complacence for her brother, a force that had from the first compelled her to behave towards the foundling with a measure of kindness, a tolerance far greater than ladies of rigid and unyielding virtue can often muster for such children. For these innocents, however blameless themselves, stand as living monuments to the incontinence of others, a perpetual breathing reproach in a world of strict manners. The captain, however, was cut from a different coarser cloth, a man of sterner, more pragmatic and calculating stuff. He could not so easily reconcile himself to what he privately condemned as a profound and foolish fault in Mr. Allworthy's otherwise sound judgment. He began to offer frequent, artfully pointed hints, suggesting with a diplomat's cunning that to adopt the fruits of sin was in its very essence to give countenance to the sin itself. He became a frequent orator at the dinner table, quoting scripture with a solemn and self-righteous air, for he was indeed well read in the good book. He would intone passages such as, "He visits the sins of the fathers upon the children, and the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge and sea-blank." From these ancient words, he constructed a cold, legalistic argument for the morality of punishing the parent's crime upon the bastard child. Though the law of the land, he would say, his voice dripping with a pious disdain he mistook for wisdom, does not positively allow the destroying of such base-born children, yet it holds them to be the children of nobody, that the Church considers them as the children of nobody, and that at the very best they ought to be brought up to the lowest and most vilest offices of the Commonwealth. Mr. Allworthy met this relentless torrent of scriptural reasoning not with heat, but with a calm and profound wisdom that seemed to emanate from a deeper well of faith. He answered, and to much more which the captain urgently pressed, that however guilty the parents might be, the children were certainly innocent, that as to the texts he had quoted, the former was a particular denunciation against the Jews for the specific sin of idolatry, of relinquishing and hating their heavenly king, and the latter was parabolically spoken, intended rather to denote the certain and necessary consequences of sin as it echoes through generations, than any express judicial sentence against the innocent. He paused, his gaze steady, and his tone grew firmer. But to represent the Almighty as avenging the sins of the guilty upon the innocent was indecent, if not blasphemous. It is to represent him acting against the first principles of natural justice and against the original notions of right and wrong which he himself has implanted in our minds, by which we are to judge not only in all matters which are not revealed, but even of the truth of revelation itself. He acknowledged that many men of standing held the same principles as the captain on this head, but he himself remained firmly and unshakably convinced to the contrary. "I will provide in the same manner for this poor infant," he declared with a finality that brooked no argument, as if a legitimate child had had the fortune to have been found in the same place. And so, while the captain was assiduously taking all opportunities to press these and like arguments, his true aim being to remove the little foundling from Mr. Allworthy's house, a fondness for the boy, which he was beginning to watch with a green and jealous eye, a different, more insidious threat was quietly brewing in the shadows of the great house. Mrs. Deborah, the parson's sister, and a woman whose curiosity was as formidable as her sense of self-importance had, through diligent and uninvited inquiry, made a discovery. This discovery, in its eventual unfolding, threatened to prove far more fatal to poor Tommy's future than all the captain's reasoned, venomous sermons combined. Whether the insatiable curiosity of this good woman had carried her on to that business like a hound on a fresh scent, or whether she acted to cement herself firmly in the good graces of Mrs. Blifil, is a matter for conjecture. For it must be noted that Mrs. Blifil, notwithstanding her outward civil behaviour to the foundling in company, frequently abused the infant in the private confines of her chamber, and her brother too for his foolish and excessive fondness to it. I will not pretend to determine her precise motive, but the result was undeniable. She had now, as she conceived in her own mind, fully and definitively detected the identity of the foundling's father. This revelation changes everything for young Tommy. If you're invested in his fate, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next dramatic installment. Now, as this was a discovery of the greatest consequence, one possessing the potential to shake the very foundations of the estate and all who dwelt within it, it becomes our duty to trace it from its very fountainhead. We shall therefore very minutely lay open those previous matters, those secret whispers and clandestine encounters by which it was produced, and for that purpose we shall be obliged to pull back the curtain and reveal all the secrets of a little family with which my reader is at present entirely unacquainted. We're delving into deep secrets next. What do you think Mrs. Deborah uncovered? Let us know your theories in the comments below, and of which the economy was so rare and extraordinary. I fear it will shock the utmost credulity of many a married person testing the very bounds of their belief in what transpires behind the closed doors of a household. The astute reader may please to recollect a previously sown detail that the young woman Jenny Jones had resided for some years in the service of a certain schoolmaster. This man of letters, at her own earnest and repeated desire, had consented to instruct her in the Latin tongue, a most unusual pursuit for a woman of her station. To do full justice to her innate genius, she had so fervently improved herself under this tutelage that she had, with the swiftness of a prodigy, blossomed into a scholar of greater acuity and understanding than the master who taught her. Indeed, though this poor man had undertaken a profession to which a measure of learning must be allowed as necessary, his scholarly attainments were the least of his commendations. He was at his core one of the best-natured fellows in the world, possessing a heart of soft and pliable material. At the same time, he was the master of such a plentiful supply of pleasantry and innate humor that he was widely reputed as the premier wit of the entire country. All the neighboring gentlemen, craving the merriment he provided, were so desirous of his company that, as the art of refusal was not among his talents, he spent a considerable portion of his time at their tables and in their drawing rooms. This was time which he might, with far greater emolument and worldly advantage, have spent in the diligent supervision of his own school. It may be easily imagined, therefore, that a gentleman so qualified by nature and so disposed by habit was in no conceivable danger of becoming formidable to the great learned seminaries of Eton or Westminster. To speak with plain honesty, the roster of his scholars was a meagre one, divided neatly into two classes. In the upper class was a single young gentleman, the son of a neighboring squire, who at the mature age of 17 was just entered into his syntaxes. In the lower class was a second son of the same gentleman, who together with 7 slow-witted parish boys was still laboring to conquer the fundamental arts of reading and writing. The meager stipend arising from this pitiful academy would hardly have indulged the schoolmaster in even the most basic luxuries of life, had he not wisely added to this office the dual roles of parish, clerk, and village barber. Furthermore, had not the benevolent Mr. Allworthy added to the whole an annuity of £10 a sum, the poor man received every Christmas, with trembling gratitude with which he was reliably enabled to cheer his heart and warm his belly during that sacred festival. Among his other assorted treasures, both tangible and otherwise, the pedagogue had acquired a wife. He had married her directly from Mr. Allworthy's kitchen, a transaction motivated primarily by her fortune, viz., the considerable sum of £20 which she had there amassed through years of frugal service. This woman, however, was not particularly amiable in her person. Whether she had once sat as a model for my friend Hogarth, I will not here determine, but she exactly resembled in feature and in ferocity the young woman who was pouring out her mistress's tea in the third picture of the Harlot's Progress. She was, besides this, a professed and devout follower of that noble sect founded by Xantippe of old. Through her unwavering devotion to this philosophy, she became a far more formidable presence in the schoolhouse than her husband, for to confess the truth, he was never the master there, or indeed anywhere else when she was present. Though her countenance did not denote any natural sweetness of temper, what little might have existed was undoubtedly soured by a particular circumstance which generally poisons the well of matrimonial felicity. For children are rightly called the pledges of love, and her husband, though they had been joined in holy matrimony for 9 full years, had given her no such pledges. This was a default for which he had no ready excuse, either from advancing age or failing health, being not yet 30 years old, and what the locals call a jolly, brisk young man. Hence arose another evil, which produced no little uneasiness for the poor pedagogue. She maintained so constant and vigilant a jealousy over him that he durst hardly speak to one woman in the parish, for the least degree of civility, or even the most innocent correspondence with any female, was sure to bring his wife upon her back, and subsequently upon his own. Ever found yourself in a situation where words were twisted into weapons? Share your own stories in the comments below. In order to guard herself against potential matrimonial injuries within her own house, and as she kept but one maidservant, She always took exquisite care to choose her from that specific order of females whose faces are taken as a kind of natural security for their virtue of this unfortunate number. Jenny Jones, as the reader hath been before informed, was a prime example, as the face of this young woman might be called pretty good security of the before-mentioned kind, and as her behaviour had been always extremely modest, a quality which is often the certain consequence of genuine understanding in women. She had passed above 4 years at Mr. Partridge's, for that indeed was the schoolmaster's name, without creating the faintest whisper of suspicion in the mind of her mistress. Nay, she had been treated with uncommon kindness, and her mistress had for a time permitted Mr. Partridge to give her those very instructions which have been before commemorated. But it is with jealousy as with the gout. When such distempers are rooted deep in the blood, there is never any true security against their breaking forth, and that often upon the slightest of occasions, and when one is least prepared. Thus it tragically happened to Mrs. Partridge, who had submitted for 4 years to her husband's teaching of this young woman, and had even suffered her to often neglect her domestic work in order to pursue her learning. For passing by the open door of the study one day, she saw the girl deep in reading, and her master leaning intimately over her shoulder to observe the text. The girl, I know not for what reason, a sudden cramp, a startled thought suddenly started up from her chair. This simple, involuntary motion was the first spark that ever set the tinder of suspicion alight in the head of her mistress. This suspicion did not, however, immediately discover itself in open fury, but lay lurking in her mind like a concealed enemy who waits for a reinforcement of additional strength before he openly declares war and proceeds upon hostile operations. And such a damning reinforcement soon arrived to corroborate her suspicion, for not long after the husband and wife being at their quiet dinner, the master, perhaps wishing to show off his pupil's progress, said casually to his maid, "Damihi aliquid potem," upon which the poor girl smiled, perhaps at the awkwardness of his pronunciation. Then, when her mistress cast a hawk's eye upon her, she blushed, possibly with a consciousness of having dared to laugh at her master. Mrs. Partridge upon this immediately fell into a thunderous fury. She discharged the wooden trencher on which she was eating directly at the head of poor Jenny, crying out, "You impudent whore! Do you play your wicked tricks with my husband before my very face?" At the same instant she rose from her chair with a carving knife clutched in her hand, with which most probably she would have executed very tragical vengeance, had not the girl taken the advantage of being nearer the door than her mistress. She avoided the impending fury by running away with the speed of a hunted doe. As for the poor husband, whether surprise had rendered him motionless, or fear, which is full as probable, had restrained him from venturing any opposition, he sat staring and trembling in his chair, nor did he once offer to move or speak, till his wife, returning breathless from the pursuit of Jenny, made some defensive measures necessary for his own preservation, and he likewise was obliged to retreat with a clumsiness that mirrored the maid's flight. This good woman was no more than the more Othello of a disposition to make a life of jealousy and follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicions. With her, as well as him, to be once in doubt was once to be resolved. She therefore ordered Jenny immediately to pack up her alls and be gone, for she was determined the girl should not sleep that night within her walls. Mr. Partridge had profited too much by bitter experience to interpose in a matter of this volcanic nature. He therefore had recourse to his usual receipt of patience, for though he was not a great adept in Latin, he remembered and well understood the advice contained in these words, leve fit quod benefactor onus. In English, a burden becomes lightest when it is well borne. This was the philosophy he always had in his mouth, and of which, to say the truth, he had often occasion to experience the truth. Jenny, her voice trembling with emotion, offered to make passionate protestations of her absolute innocence, but the tempest was too strong for her voice to be heard over its roar. She then betook herself to the melancholy business of packing, for which a small quantity of brown paper sufficed, and having received her small pittance of wages, she returned to the home of her parents, her reputation in tatters, and her future uncertain. The plot thickens with every chapter. Subscribe now to unravel the mystery of Tom Jones alongside us. The schoolmaster and his furious consort passed their time unpleasantly enough that evening, but something or other, a tearful apology, a calculated plea, happened before the next morning which a little abated the hurricane-force fury of Mrs. Partridge. She at length admitted her husband to make his excuses. To these she gave the readier belief, as he had, instead of foolishly desiring her to recall Jenny, professed a grim satisfaction in her being dismissed. He said she was grown of little use as a servant, spending all her time in reading, and was become moreover very pert and obstinate, for indeed she and her master had lately had frequent and heated disputes in literature, in which, as hath been said, she was become greatly his superior. This, however, he would by no means allow, and as he called her persisting in the right obstinacy, he began to hate her with no small inveteracy, a resentment born of wounded pride and scholarly humiliation. For the reasons meticulously detailed in our preceding chapter, and from certain other matrimonial concessions, well known to most husbands, those arcane mysteries which, like the sacred secrets of the Freemasonry, should be divulged to none who are not members of that honorable fraternity. Mrs. Partridge found herself pretty well satisfied that she had condemned her husband without just cause. This realization, a bitter pill to her proud nature, spurred her to endeavor through a series of uncharacteristic acts of kindness to make him a generous amends for her false suspicion. It must be understood that her passions were indeed equally violent whichever direction they inclined, for as she could be extremely and tempestuously angry, so could she be altogether as fond and effusively affectionate. But though these two opposing passions ordinarily succeeded each other with a dizzying rapidity, and scarce 24 hours ever passed in which the poor pedagogue was not in some degree the object of both her fiery love and her icy wrath. Yet, on extraordinary occasions, when the passion of anger had raged to a truly volcanic intensity, the period of remission was usually proportionally longer, and so it was in the present case, for she continued in a state of uninterrupted affability for a longer stretch of time after this particular fit of jealousy had ended than her long-suffering husband had ever known before. In fact, had it not been for some little exercises of temper, those necessary daily performances which all the devout followers of Xantippe are obliged to execute, Mr. Partridge would have enjoyed a perfect and almost miraculous serenity of several months. Yet perfect calms at sea are always suspected by the experienced mariner to be the sly forerunners of a devastating storm. And I know some persons who, without being generally the devotees of superstition, are apt to apprehend that any great and unusual peace or tranquility will inevitably be attended with its violent opposite, for which very reason the wise ancients used on such deceptively quiet occasions to sacrifice to the goddess Nemesis, a deity who was thought by them to look with an invidious and malignant eye on any prolonged human felicity, and to have a peculiar delight in suddenly overturning it. As we in this modern age are very far from believing in any such heathen goddess, or from encouraging any groundless superstition, so we heartily wish Mr. John Fro, or some other such penetrating philosopher, would bestir himself a little in order to find out the real tangible cause of this sudden transition from good to bad fortune, which hath been so often remarked in human affairs. It is a perplexing pattern, and one of which we shall now proceed to give a stark instance, for it is our humble province to relate facts as they occur, and we shall leave the pondering of deep-rooted causes to persons of a much higher genius. Now mankind in all its varieties have always taken a great and often uncharitable delight in knowing and descanting on the actions of others. Hence, there have been in all ages and across all nations certain places set apart for public rendezvous, where the curious might meet and satisfy their mutual and insatiable curiosity. Among these, the barbers' shops have justly borne the preeminence for the male sex. Among the Greeks, barber's news was a common proverbial expression, and the poet Horace, in one of his epistles, makes honorable mention of the Roman barbers in precisely the same light. Those of England, I can attest, are known to be no wise inferior to their Greek or Roman predecessors. Within their hallowed walls you may hear foreign affairs discussed in a manner little inferior to that with which they are handled in the great coffee houses of London, and domestic occurrences are often much more largely and freely treated in the former than in the latter. But this venerable institution serves only for the edification of men. Now, whereas the females of this country, especially those of the lower order, do associate themselves much more frequently and intimately than those of other nations, our national polity would be highly deficient if they had not some place set apart likewise for the indulgence of their own keen curiosity, seeing they are in this regard no way inferior to the other half of the species. In enjoying therefore such a place of regular rendezvous, the British fair ought to esteem themselves more happy than any of their foreign sisters, as I do not remember either to have read in history or to have seen in all my travels anything exactly of the like kind. This place then is no other than the chandler's shop, the known seat of all news, or, as it is more vulgarly called, gossiping in every parish in England. It is the unofficial parliament of the distaff side, a court of female inquiry and judgment. It happened that Mrs. Partridge, being one day at this lively assembly of females, was asked by one of her neighbours, with a casual air that belied deep intent, if she had heard no news lately of Jenny Jones, to this, Mrs.? Partridge answered in the negative, her guard down. Upon this, the other replied with a thin, knowing smile that the parish was very much obliged to her for having turned Jenny away as she did. Mrs. Partridge, whose jealousy, as the reader well knows, was long since cured, and who had no other lingering quarrel with her former maid, answered boldly. She did not know any obligation the parish had to her on that account, for she believed Jenny had scarce left her equal behind her in diligence or modesty. No, truly said the gossip, her eyes glinting with the pleasure of delivering a blow. I hope not, though I fancy we have sluts enow too. Then you have not heard. It seems that she hath been brought to bed of 2 bastards, but, as they are not born here, my husband and the other overseer says we shall not be obliged to keep them. 2 bastards, answered Mrs. Partridge hastily, the colour draining from her face. You surprise me. I don't know whether we must keep them, but I am sure they must have been begotten here, for the wench hath not been 9 months gone away. Nothing can be so quick and sudden as the operations of the mind, especially when hope or fear or jealousy, to which the 2 others are but mere journeymen, set it to work. It occurred instantly to her, like a lightning strike, that Jenny had scarce ever been out of her own house while she lived with her. The memory of her husband leaning over the chair, the girl's sudden starting up, the Latin phrase, the secret smile, and 100 other little things rushed upon her all at once in a damning flood. The satisfaction her husband had expressed in Jenny's departure appeared now to be only cleverly dissembled. Then, in the very same instant, it seemed real again, but a real satisfaction, born of satiety, of a passion spent, and 100 other bad causes. In a word, she was instantly and utterly convinced of her husband's guilt, and immediately left the assembly in a profound and visible confusion. As fair Grimalkin, who, though the youngest of the feline family, degenerates not in ferocity from the elder branches of her house, and though inferior in strength, is equal in fierceness to the noble tiger himself, when a little mouse, whom it hath long tormented in sport, escapes from her clutches for a while, frets, scolds, growls, swears, but if the trunk or box behind which the mouse lay hid be again removed, she flies like lightning on her prey, and with envenomed wrath bites, scratches, mumbles, and tears the little animal. Asterisk, asterisk, this drama is unfolding quickly. What do you think will happen next? Scribe, and leave your predictions in the comments asterisk asterisk. Not with less fury did Mrs. Partridge fly upon the poor unsuspecting pedagogue. Her tongue, her teeth, and her hands fell upon him all at once in a whirlwind of vengeance. His wig was in an instant torn from his head, his shirt was rent from his back, and from his face descended 5 distinct streams of blood, denoting the number of claws with which nature had so unhappily armed the enemy. Mr. Partridge acted for some time on the defensive only. Indeed, he attempted nothing more than to guard his beleaguered face with his hands, but as he found that his antagonist abated nothing of her raging fury, he thought he might at least endeavor to disarm her, or rather to confine her arms, in doing which her cap fell off in the struggle, and her hair, being too short to reach her shoulders, erected itself on her head in a furious halo. Her stays likewise, which were laced through one single hole at the bottom, burst open, and her breasts, which were much more redundant than her hair, hung down below her middle. Her face was likewise marked with the blood of her husband, her teeth gnashed with rage, and fire, such as sparkles from a smith's forge, darted from her eyes, so that altogether this Amazonian heroine might have been an object of terror to a much bolder man than Mr. Partridge. He had at length the good fortune, by getting possession of her arms, to render those weapons which she wore at the ends of her fingers useless, which she no sooner perceived than the softness of her sex prevailed over her rage, and she presently dissolved in a torrent of tears, which soon after concluded in a fit of the vapours. That small share of sense which Mr. Partridge had hitherto preserved through this scene of inexplicable fury, of the cause of which he was hitherto entirely ignorant, now utterly abandoned him. He ran instantly into the street, hallooing out that his wife was in the agonies of death, and beseeching the neighbours to fly with the utmost haste to her assistance. Several good women obeyed his summons, who, entering his house and applying the usual remedies on such occasions, smelling salts, sharp slaps, and fervent prayers, Mrs. Partridge was at length, to the great joy of her terrified husband, brought to herself. As soon as she had a little recollected her spirits and somewhat composed herself with a restorative cordial, she began to inform the assembled company of the manifold injuries she had received from her husband, who she said was not contented to injure her in her own bed, but upon her upbraiding him with it, had treated her in the cruelest manner imaginable, had tore her cap and hair from her head, and her stays from her body, giving her, at the same time, several brutal blows, the marks of which she should carry to the grave. The poor man, who bore on his face many more visible marks of the indignation of his wife, stood in silent astonishment at this fantastic accusation, which the reader will, I believe, readily bear witness for him, had greatly exceeded the truth, for indeed he had not struck her once, and this silence being interpreted to be a confession of the charge by the whole court of female justice, they all began at once, times una voce, times to rebuke and revile him, repeating often that none but a coward ever struck a woman. Mr. Partridge bore all this patiently, the very picture of martyred innocence. But when his wife appealed to the blood on her face as an evidence of his barbarity, he could not help laying claim to his own blood, for so it really was, as he thought it very unnatural that this should rise up, as we are taught, that of a murdered person often doth in vengeance against him. To this the women made no other answer than that it was a pity it had not come from his heart instead of his face, all declaring with one voice that if their husbands should ever dare to lift their hands against them, they would have their hearts' bloods out of their bodies. After much admonition for what was past, and much good advice to Mr. Partridge for his future behaviour, the company at length departed, and left the husband and wife to a personal conference together, in which Mr. Partridge soon learned to his utter dismay the cause of all his sufferings. I believe it is a true and steadfast observation, confirmed by the chronicles of human folly, that few secrets are ever divulged to one person only. For a whisper shared is a whisper destined for the world, but certainly it would be next to a miracle, a suspension of the very laws of nature, that a fact of this salacious kind, once known to a whole parish, should not transpire any farther, seeping through the boundaries of the village like a flood through a sieve, and indeed a very few days had passed before the entire country, to use a common phrase, times rung times with the name of the schoolmaster of Little Baddington. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the scandal. He was said in hushed and horrified tones to have beaten his wife in the most cruel and savage manner. Nay, the story mutated and grew with each telling. In some places, it was reported he had murdered her. In others, that he had broke her arms. In others, her legs. In short, there was scarce an injury which can be done to a human creature. But what Mrs. Partridge was somewhere or other affirmed to have received from her husband's brutal hand, the single truth of a quarrel had blossomed into 100 monstrous fictions. The cause of this quarrel was likewise variously reported, a kaleidoscope of speculation. For as some people said, with leering confidence, that Mrs. Partridge had caught her husband in bed with his maid, so many other reasons of a very different kind went abroad. Nay, in a curious reversal, some transferred the guilt entirely to the wife and the jealousy to the husband, painting Mr. Partridge as the wronged party. Now the esteemed Mrs. Wilkins had long ago heard the distant rumble of this quarrel, but as a different cause from the true one had reached her sharp ears, she thought it proper to conceal it within her vast repository of secrets. She was motivated all the more, perhaps, as the blame was universally and conveniently laid on Mr. Partridge and his wife during her former service to Mr. Allworthy, had in some forgotten trifle offended Mrs. Wilkins, who was not of a very forgiving or forgetful temper, but Mrs. Wilkins, whose eyes could see objects at a great distance, and who could very well look forward a few years into the murky waters of futurity, had perceived a strong likelihood of Captain Blifil's being hereafter her master. She was a student of power, and she understood its shifting currents. As she plainly discerned that the captain bore no great goodwill to the little foundling, she fancied it would be rendering him an agreeable and most valuable service if she could make any discoveries that might lessen the profound affection which Mr. Allworthy seemed to have contracted for this child, an affection which gave visible uneasiness to the captain, who could not entirely conceal it even before Allworthy himself. His wife, who acted her part with much greater finesse in public, frequently recommended to him her own example, that of conniving at the folly of her brother, which she said she at least as well perceived and as much resented as any other possibly could. Mrs. Wilkins having therefore by a fortuitous accident gotten a true scent of the above story, though long after it had happened, failed not to satisfy herself thoroughly of all the particulars, digging for the truth with the dedication of a gravedigger. Then she sought a private audience and acquainted the captain that she had at last discovered the true father of the little bastard, which she was sorry, she said, to see her master lose his reputation in the country by taking so much notice of. The captain, with a performance of great gravity, chid her for the conclusion of her speech as an improper assurance in judging of her master's actions. For if his honour or his understanding would have suffered the captain to make an alliance with Mrs. Wilkins, his immense pride would by no means have admitted it. And to say the truth, there is no conduct less politic than to enter into any confederacy with your friend's servants against their master, for by these means you afterwards become the slave of these very servants. by whom you are constantly liable to be betrayed. And this shrewd consideration, perhaps it was, which prevented Captain Blifil from being more explicit with Mrs. Wilkins, or from openly encouraging the abuse which she had so freely bestowed on Allworthy. But though he declared no satisfaction to Mrs. Wilkins at this discovery, he enjoyed not a little from it in the secret chambers of his own mind, and resolved to make the best use of it he was able. It was a weapon, and he would find the perfect moment to wield it. He kept this matter a long time, concealed within his own breast, in hopes that Mr. Allworthy might hear it from some other person, thus sparing him the unseemly task of bearing ill tidings. But Mrs. Wilkins, whether she resented the captain's cold and chiding behavior, or whether his cunning was beyond her, and she feared the discovery might displease him, never afterwards opened her lips about the matter to anyone of consequence. I have thought it somewhat strange upon reflection that the housekeeper never acquainted Mrs. Blifil with this news, as women are more inclined to communicate all pieces of intelligence to their own sex than to ours. The only way, as it appears to me, of solving this difficulty is by imputing it to that distinct chill and distance which was now grown between the lady and the housekeeper. This arose perhaps from a jealousy in Mrs. Blifil that Wilkins showed too great a respect to the foundling, for while the housekeeper was secretly endeavouring to ruin the little infant standing in order to ingratiate herself with the captain, she was every day more and more commending it before Allworthy, as his fondness for it every day increased. This duplicity, notwithstanding all the care she took at other times to express the direct contrary to Mrs. Blifil, perhaps offended that delicate lady, who certainly now hated Mrs. Wilkins, and though she did not, or possibly could not, absolutely remove her from her place, she found, however, the means of making her life very uneasy. This Mrs. Wilkins at length so resented that she very openly showed all manner of respect and fondness to little Tommy, in direct and spiteful opposition to Mrs. Blifil. Who do you think is the more cunning player in this game of secrets? Share your theories in the comments below. The captain, therefore, finding the story in danger of perishing from silence, at last took a carefully orchestrated opportunity to reveal it himself. He was one day engaged with Mr. Allworthy in a discourse on charity, a subject upon which the captain could hold forth with great if superficial learning. He proved to Mr. Allworthy with a cascade of references, that the word charity in Scripture nowhere means beneficence or generosity. The Christian religion, he said, was instituted for much nobler purposes than to enforce a lesson which many heathen philosophers had taught us long before, and which, though it might perhaps be called a moral virtue, savoured but little of that sublime Christian-like disposition, that vast elevation of thought in purity approaching to angelic perfection, to be attained, expressed, and felt only by grace. Those, he said with a condescending air, came nearer to the Scripture, meaning who understood by it candour, or the forming of a benevolent opinion of our brethren and passing a favourable judgment on their actions, a virtue much higher and more extensive in its nature than a pitiful distribution of alms, which though we would never so much prejudice or even ruin our families, could never reach many, whereas charity, in the other and truer sense, might be extended to all mankind. He said, considering who the disciples were simple fishermen and men of low estate, it would be absurd to conceive the doctrine of generosity or giving alms to have been preached to them. And as we could not well imagine this doctrine should be preached by its divine author to men who could not practice it, much less should we think it understood so by those who can practice it and do not. But though, continued he, weaving his web, there is, I am afraid, little merit in these benefactions, there would, I must confess, be much pleasure in them to a good mind, if it was not abated by one piercing consideration. I mean that we are liable to be imposed upon, and to confer our choicest favors often on the undeserving, as you must own, was your case in your bounty to that worthless fellow Partridge. For 2 or 3 such examples must greatly lessen the inward satisfaction which a good man would otherwise find in generosity, nay, may even make him timorous in bestowing, lest he should be guilty of supporting vice and encouraging the wicked, a crime of a very black dye, and for which it will by no means be a sufficient excuse that we have not actually intended such an encouragement, unless we have used the utmost caution in choosing the objects of our beneficence, a consideration which I make no doubt hath greatly checked the liberality of many a worthy and pious man. Mr. Allworthy answered with his customary calm reason. He could not dispute with the captain in the Greek language, and therefore could say nothing as to the true sense of the word which is translated charity, but that he had always thought it was interpreted to consist in action, and that giving alms constituted at least one branch of that virtue. As to the meritorious part, he said he readily agreed with the captain, for where could be the merit of barely discharging a duty which, he said, let the word charity have what construction it would it sufficiently appear to be from the whole tenor of the New Testament, and as he thought it an indispensable duty enjoined both by the Christian law and by the law of nature itself, so was it withal so pleasant that if any duty could be said to be its own reward, or to pay us while we are discharging it, it was this. To confess the truth, said he, his voice filled with a simple sincerity that stood in stark contrast to the captain's calculated rhetoric, there is one degree of generosity, of charity, I would have called it, which seems to have some show of merit. And that is where, from a principle of benevolence and Christian love, we bestow on another what we really want ourselves, where in order to lessen the distresses of another, we condescend to share some part of them by giving what even our own necessities cannot well spare. This is, I think, meritorious, but to relieve our brethren only with our superfluities. To be charitable, I must use the word rather at the expense of our coffers than ourselves, to save several families from misery rather than hang up an extraordinary picture in our houses or gratify any other idle, ridiculous vanity. This seems to be only being human creatures. Nay, I will venture to go farther. It is being in some degree epicures. For what could the greatest epicure wish rather than to eat with many mouths instead of one, which I think may be predicated of any one who knows that the bread of many is owing to his own largesses, As to the apprehension of bestowing bounty on such as may hereafter prove unworthy objects, because many have proved such, surely it can never deter a good man from generosity. I do not think a few or many examples of ingratitude can justify a man's hardening his heart against the distresses of his fellow creatures, nor do I believe it can ever have such effect on a truly benevolent mind. Nothing less than a persuasion of universal depravity can lock up the charity of a good man, and this persuasion must lead him, I think, either into atheism or enthusiasm. But surely it is unfair to argue such universal depravity from a few vicious individuals. Nor was this, I believe, ever done by a man who, upon searching his own mind, found one certain exception to the general rule. He then concluded by asking, with a genuine and unfeigned puzzlement, who that Partridge was, whom he had called a worthless fellow. "I mean," said the captain, the moment he had been waiting for finally at hand, "Partridge the barber, the schoolmaster. What do you call him, Partridge? The father of the little child which you found in your own bed. Asterisk, asterisk. The plot twists are relentless. Subscribe now to follow every shocking revelation in this intricate tale. Asterisk, asterisk. Mr. Allworthy expressed great surprise at this account, and the captain feigned as great at his ignorance of it, for he said he had known it above a month, and at length recollected with much difficulty that he was told it by Mrs. Wilkins. Upon this, Wilkins was immediately summoned, who, having confirmed what the captain had said, was by Mr. Allworthy by, and with the captain's own advice, dispatched to Little Baddington to inform herself of the truth of the fact. The captain expressed great dislike at all hasty proceedings in criminal matters, and said he would by no means have Mr. Allworthy take any resolution either to the prejudice of the child or its father before he was satisfied that the latter was guilty. This was a masterstroke of his dissimulation, for though he had privately satisfied himself of this from one of Partridge's neighbours, yet he was too generous to give any such evidence to Mr. Allworthy, preferring to appear the voice of caution and fairness. It may rightly be wondered at a point of genuine perplexity how a story so well known a narrative, which had furnished so much rich matter for conversation in every alehouse and market cross, should never have been whispered to Mr. Allworthy himself. He was perhaps the only soul in that entire country who walked in a blessed ignorance, a solitary island in a sea of scandalous chatter. To account in some measure for this peculiarity to the reader, I think it proper to inform him that there was no one in the kingdom less interested in opposing that self-serving doctrine concerning the meaning of the word charity which hath been seen in the preceding chapter than our good man. Indeed, he was equally entitled to this virtue in either of its proposed senses, for as no man was ever more acutely sensible of the wants of his fellows, or more ready to relieve their distresses with an open hand, so none could be more tender of their characters, or slower to believe anything to their disadvantage. His heart was a fortress, and scandal found its gates forever locked. Scandal therefore never found any access to his table. Its venomous breath was purged by the very atmosphere of his home. For as it hath been long since observed, that you may know a man by his companions, so I will venture to say, that by attending to the conversation at a great man's table, You may satisfy yourself of his religion, his politics, his taste, and indeed of his entire disposition, though a few odd fellows will utter their own sentiments in all places with reckless abandon, yet much the greater part of mankind have enough of the courtier in them to accommodate their conversation to the taste and inclination of their superiors. At Paradise Hall, the topic of a schoolmaster's alleged indiscretion was simply not a currency that held any value. But to return to Mrs. Wilkins, who, having executed her commission with great dispatch, though it required a journey of 15 miles, brought back such a damning confirmation of the schoolmaster's guilt that Mr. Allworthy's hand was forced. He determined to send for the criminal and examine him times, viva voce times, to let the man speak in his own defense. Mr. Partridge therefore was summoned to attend in order to present his defense, if any defense he could possibly make against this grave and shocking accusation. At the time appointed before Mr. Allworthy himself in the solemn hall of Paradise came as well the said Partridge, with Anne his wife, as Mrs. Wilkins, his zealous accuser. The room felt heavy with impending judgment, and now Mr. Allworthy being seated in the chair of justice, a makeshift throne of moral authority, Mr. Partridge was brought before him, having heard his accusation from the mouth of Mrs. Wilkins, who detailed the events with a relish that bordered on the theatrical. He pleaded not guilty, his voice a mixture of desperation and defiance. He made many vehement protestations of his innocence, his hands trembling as he called upon heaven to witness his plight. Mrs. Partridge was then examined, who, after a modest and perfunctory apology for being obliged to speak the truth against her husband, related all the circumstances with which the reader hath already been acquainted. The Latin phrase, the smile, the flight, the confrontation. She was a reluctant instrument of justice, her words heavy with a shared shame. At last, she concluded with the most damning piece of all her husband's own confession of his guilt. Whether she had truly forgiven him or no, I will not venture to determine, but it is certain she was an unwilling witness in this cause. It is probable, from certain other reasons tied to her own pride and their shared poverty, that she would never have been brought to depose, as she did, had not Mrs. Wilkins, with great art and insinuation, fished all out of her at her own house. Nor would she have spoken had Mrs. Wilkins not indeed made persuasive promises in Mr. Allworthy's name that the punishment of her husband should not be such as might anywise affect his family's meagre livelihood. Partridge, his back against the wall, still persisted in asserting his innocence, though he admitted he had made the above-mentioned confession. This he, however, endeavored to account for by protesting with a desperate energy that he was forced into it by the continued and savage importunity his wife had used. She had vowed, he claimed, that as she was sure of his guilt, she would never leave tormenting him till he had owned it, and had faithfully promised that in such a case she would never mention it to him more. Hence, he said, he had been induced falsely to confess himself guilty, though he was innocent, a peace purchased with a lie, and he cried out, I believe I should have confessed a murder from the very same motive. This was too much for Mrs. Partridge to bear. Having no other remedy in the present place but tears, she called forth a plentiful assistance from them, a torrent of wounded virtue. Then, addressing herself to Mr. Allworthy, she said, or rather cried, "May it please your worship, there never was any poor woman so injured as I am by that base man, for this is not the only instance of his falsehood to me. No, may it please your worship, he hath injured my bed. Many's the good time, and often I could have put up with his drunkenness and his neglect of his business, if he had not broke one of the sacred commandments. Besides, if it had been out of doors, I had not mattered it so much. But with my own servant in my own house, under my own roof, to defile my own chaste bed, which to be sure he hath with his beastly stinking whores. Yes, you villain, you have defiled my own bed, you have, and then you have charged me with bullocking you into owning the truth." She continued, her voice rising to a shriek. "It is very likely, and please your worship, that I should bullock him. I have marks enow about my body to show of his cruelty to me. If you had been a man, you villain, you would have scorned to injure a woman in that manner, but you aren't half a man, you know it, nor have you been half a husband to me." She then turned to a fresh catalogue of grievances. "You need run after whores, you need, when I'm sure. And since he provokes me, I am ready and please your worship to take my bodily oath that I found them abed together. What you have forgot, I suppose, when you beat me into a fit and made the blood run down my forehead, because I only civilly taxed you with adultery, but I can prove it by all my neighbours. You have almost broke my heart. You have. Here, Mr. Allworthy interrupted his voice, a calm island in her storm of fury, and begged her to be pacified, promising her that she should have justice. Then, turning to Partridge, who stood aghast, one half of his wits being hurried away by surprise, and the other half by paralyzing fear, he said he was sorry to see there was so wicked a man in the world. He assured him that his prevaricating and lying backward and forward was a great aggravation of his guilt, for which the only atonement he could make was by a full confession and genuine repentance. He exhorted him therefore to begin by immediately confessing the fact, and not to persist in denying what was so plainly proved against him, even by his own wife. ***. This trial is reaching its climax. Who do you believe is telling the truth? Subscribe and let us know your verdict in the comments ***. Here, reader, I beg your patience a moment while I make a just compliment to the great wisdom and sagacity of our English law, which refuses to admit the evidence of a wife for or against her husband. This, says a certain learned author, who I believe was never quoted before in any but a law book, would be the means of creating an eternal dissension between them. It would indeed be the means of much perjury and of much whipping, fining, imprisoning, transporting, and hanging, a wise precaution, as this very scene so vividly demonstrates. Partridge stood a while silent, a man trapped in a nightmare till being bid to speak. He said he had already spoken the truth and appealed to heaven for his innocence. Lastly, he turned to the girl herself, whom he desired his worship immediately to send for he was ignorant, or at least pretended to be, so that she had already fled that part of the country, a ghost who had vanished with the truth. Mr. Allworthy, whose natural love of justice joined to his coolness of temper, made him always a most patient magistrate, in hearing all the witnesses which an accused person could produce in his defense, agreed to defer his final determination of this matter till the arrival of Jenny. For her, he immediately dispatched a messenger, and then, having recommended peace between Partridge and his wife, though he addressed himself chiefly to the wrong person, he appointed them to attend again the third day. For he had sent Jenny a whole day's journey from his own house. At the appointed time the parties all assembled, the tension once again thick in the air. The messenger returning brought word that sealed Partridge's fate. Jenny was not to be found. For that she had left her habitation a few days before, in company with a recruiting officer, following the drum and abandoning her past. Mr. Allworthy then declared that the evidence of such a slut as she appeared to be would have deserved no credit, but he said he could not help thinking that had she been present and would have declared the truth, she must have confirmed what so many circumstances, together with his own confession and the declaration of his wife that she had pressed him into it, did sufficiently prove. He therefore once more exhorted Partridge to confess, but he still avowing his innocence with the last of his strength, Mr. Allworthy declared himself satisfied of his guilt. He pronounced that Partridge was too bad a man to receive any encouragement from him. He therefore deprived him of his annuity, that crucial £10 a year, and recommended repentance to him on account of another world and industry to maintain himself and his wife in this. There were not perhaps many more unhappy persons than poor Partridge. He had lost the best part of his income by the evidence of his own wife, and yet was daily upbraided by her for having, among other things, been the occasion of depriving her of that benefit. Such was his cruel fortune, and he was obliged to submit to it with a broken spirit. Though I called him poor Partridge in the last paragraph, I would have the reader rather impute that epithet to the compassion in my own temper than conceive it to be any declaration of his innocence. Whether he was innocent or not will perhaps appear hereafter, but if the historic muse hath entrusted me with any secrets, I will by no means be guilty of discovering them till she shall give me leave. Here therefore the reader must suspend his curiosity. Certain it is that, whatever was the truth of the case, there was evidence more than sufficient to convict him before Allworthy. Indeed, much less would have satisfied a bench of justices on an order of bastardy. And yet, notwithstanding the positiveness of Mrs. Partridge, who would have taken the sacrament upon the matter, there is a lingering possibility that the schoolmaster was entirely innocent. For though it appeared clear, on comparing the time when Jenny departed from Little Baddington with that of her delivery, that she had there conceived this infant, yet it by no means followed of necessity that Partridge must have been its father. To omit other particulars, there was in the same house a lad near 18, between whom and Jenny there had subsisted sufficient intimacy to found a reasonable suspicion. And yet so blind is jealousy, this obvious circumstance never once entered into the head of the enraged wife. Whether Partridge repented or not, according to Mr. Allworthy's advice, is not so apparent. Certain it is that his wife repented heartily of the evidence she had given against him, especially when she found Mrs. Deborah had deceived her, and now refused to make any application to Mr. Allworthy on her behalf. She had, however, somewhat better success with Mrs. Blifil, who was, as the reader must have perceived, a much better-tempered woman, and very kindly undertook to solicit her brother to restore the annuity, in which, though good nature might have some share, yet a stronger and more natural motive will appear in the next chapter. These solicitations were nevertheless unsuccessful, for though Mr. Allworthy did not think, with some late writers, that mercy consists only in punishing offenders, yet he was as far from thinking that it is proper to this excellent quality to pardon great criminals wantonly without any reason whatever. Any doubtfulness of the fact or any circumstance of mitigation was never disregarded by him, but the petitions of an offender or the intercessions of others did not in the least affect him. In a word, he never pardoned, because the offender himself or his friends were unwilling that he should be punished. Asterisk. Asterisk. The consequences of this judgment are far-reaching. Like and share this chapter if you're captivated by the intricate moral web of Tom Jones. Asterisk. Asterisk. Partridge and his wife were therefore both obliged to submit to their fate, which was indeed severe enough, for so far was he from doubling his industry on the account of his lessened income that he did in a manner abandon himself to a profound despair. As he was by nature indolent, that vice now increased upon him, by which means he lost the little school he had, so that neither his wife nor himself would have had any bread to eat, had not the charity of some good Christian interposed and provided them with what was just sufficient for their bare sustenance. As this support was conveyed to them by an unknown hand, they imagined, and so I doubt not will the reader, that Mr. Allworthy himself was their secret benefactor, who, though he would not openly encourage vice, could yet privately relieve the distresses of the vicious themselves when these became too exquisite and disproportionate to their demerit, in which light their wretchedness appeared now to Fortune herself, for she at length took pity on this miserable couple, and considerably lessened the wretched state of Partridge by putting a final end to that of his wife, who soon after caught the smallpox and died. The justice which Mr. Allworthy had executed on Partridge at first met with universal approbation, but no sooner had he felt its consequences than his neighbours began to relent and to compassionate his case. Presently after, they began to blame that as rigour and severity which they before had called justice. They now exclaimed against punishing in cold blood, and sang forth the praises of mercy and forgiveness. Their memories conveniently short, these cries were considerably increased by the death of Mrs. Partridge, though owing to the distemper above mentioned, which is no necessary consequence of poverty or distress, many were not ashamed to impute it to Mr. Partridge. Allworthy's severity, or as they now termed it, his cruelty. Partridge, having now lost his wife, his school, and his annuity, and the unknown person, having now discontinued the last mentioned charity, resolved to change the scene. He left the country where he was, in certain danger of starving, yet he departed with the universal, if unhelpful, compassion of all his neighbours. Though the captain had effectually demolished poor Partridge, yet had he not reaped the harvest he hoped for, which was to turn the foundling out of Mr. Allworthy's house. On the contrary, that gentleman grew every day fonder of little Tommy, as if he intended to counterbalance his severity to the father with extraordinary fondness and affection towards the son. This a good deal soured the captain's temper, as did all the other daily instances of Mr. Allworthy's generosity, for he looked on all such largesses to be diminutions of his own wealth. In this, we have said, he did not agree with his wife, nor indeed in anything else, for, though an affection placed on the understanding is by many wise persons thought more durable than that which is founded on beauty, yet it happened otherwise in the present case. Nay, the understandings of this couple were their principal bone of contention, and one great cause of many quarrels which from time to time arose between them, and which at last ended on the side of the lady in a sovereign contempt for her husband, and on the husband's in an utter abhorrence of his wife, as these had both exercised their talents chiefly in the study of divinity. This was from their first acquaintance the most common topic of conversation between them. The captain, like a well-bred man, had before marriage always given up his opinion to that of the lady, and this not in the clumsy, awkward manner of a conceited blockhead, who, while he civilly yields to a superior in an argument, is desirous of being still known to think himself in the right. The captain, on the contrary, though one of the proudest fellows in the world, so absolutely yielded the victory to his antagonist that she, who had not the least doubt of his sincerity, retired always from the dispute with an admiration of her own understanding and a love for his. But though this complaisance to one whom the captain thoroughly despised was not so uneasy to him as it would have been, had any hopes of preferment made it necessary to show the same submission to a Hoadley or to some other of great reputation in the science, yet even this cost him too much to be endured without some motive. Matrimony, therefore, having removed all such motives, he grew weary of this condescension, and began to treat the opinions of his wife with that haughtiness and insolence which none but those who deserve some contempt themselves can bestow, and those only who deserve no contempt can bear. When the first torrent of tenderness was over, and when in the calm and long interval between the fits, reason began to open the eyes of the lady, and she saw this alteration of behavior in the captain, who at length answered all her barren arguments only with pish and shaw. She was far from enduring the indignity with a tame submission. Indeed, it at first so highly provoked her that it might have produced some tragical event had it not taken a more harmless turn, by filling her with the utmost contempt for her husband's understanding, which somewhat qualified her hatred towards him, though of this likewise she had a pretty moderate share. The captain's hatred to her was of a purer kind, for as to any imperfections in her knowledge or understanding, he no more despised her for them than for her not being 6 feet high. In his opinion of the female sex, he exceeded the moroseness of Aristotle himself. He looked on a woman as on an animal of domestic use of somewhat higher consideration than a cat, since her offices were of rather more importance. But the difference between these two was, in his estimation, so small that in his marriage, contracted with Mr. Allworthy's lands and tenements, it would have been pretty equal which of them he had taken into the bargain. And yet so tender was his pride that it felt the contempt which his wife now began to express towards him, and this, added to the surfeit he had before taken of her love, created in him a degree of disgust and abhorrence, perhaps hardly to be exceeded. One situation only of the married state is excluded from pleasure, and that is a state of indifference. But as many of my readers I hope know what an exquisite delight there is in conveying pleasure to a beloved object. So some few, I am afraid, may have experienced the satisfaction of tormenting one we hate. It is, I apprehend, to come at this latter pleasure that we see both sexes often give up that ease in marriage which they might otherwise possess, though their mate was never so disagreeable to them. Hence the wife often puts on fits of love and jealousy, nay, even denies herself any pleasure to disturb and prevent those of her husband, and he, again in return, puts frequent restraints on himself and stays at home in company which he dislikes, in order to confine his wife to what she equally detests. Hence too must flow those tears which a widow sometimes so plentifully sheds over the ashes of a husband with whom she led a life of constant disquiet and turbulency, and whom now she can never hope to torment any more. But if ever any couple enjoyed this pleasure, it was, at present, experienced by the captain and his lady. It was always a sufficient reason to either of them to be obstinate in any opinion that the other had previously asserted the contrary. If the one proposed any amusement, the other constantly objected to it. They never loved or hated, commended or abused the same person, and for this reason, as the captain looked with an evil eye on the little foundling, his wife began now to caress it almost equally with her own child. The reader will be apt to conceive that this behavior between the husband and wife did not greatly contribute to Mr. Allworthy's repose, as it tended so little to that serene happiness which he had designed for all three from this alliance. But the truth is, though he might be a little disappointed in his sanguine expectations, yet he was far from being acquainted with the whole matter, for, as the captain was from certain obvious reasons much on his guard before him, the lady was obliged, for fear of her brother's displeasure, to pursue the same conduct. In fact, it is possible for a third person to be very intimate, nay, even to live long in the same house with a married couple who have any tolerable discretion, and not even guess at the sour sentiments which they bear to each other, for though the whole day may be sometimes too short for hatred as well as for love, yet the many hours which they naturally spend together, apart from all observers, furnish people of tolerable moderation with such ample opportunity for the enjoyment of either passion that if they love they can support being a few hours in company without toying, or if they hate, without spitting in each other's faces. It is possible, however, that Mr. Allworthy saw enough to render him a little uneasy, for we are not always to conclude that a wise man is not hurt because he doth not cry out and lament himself like those of a childish or effeminate temper. But indeed it is possible he might see some faults in the captain without any uneasiness at all, for men of true wisdom and goodness are contented to take persons and things as they are, without complaining of their imperfections or attempting to amend them. They can see a fault in a friend, a relation, or an acquaintance, without ever mentioning it to the parties themselves or to any others, and this often without lessening their affection. Indeed, unless great discernment be tempered with this overlooking disposition, we ought never to contract friendship, but with a degree of folly which we can deceive. For I hope my friends will pardon me when I declare I know none of them without a fault, and I should be sorry if I could imagine I had any friend who could not see mine. Forgiveness of this kind we give and demand in turn, It is an exercise of friendship, and perhaps none of the least pleasant, and this forgiveness we must bestow without desire of amendment. There is perhaps no surer mark of folly than an attempt to correct the natural infirmities of those we love. The finest composition of human nature, as well as the finest china, may have a flaw in it, and this, I am afraid, in either case, is equally incurable, though nevertheless the pattern may remain of the highest value. Upon the whole, then, Mr. Allworthy certainly saw some imperfections in the captain, but as this was a very artful man, and eternally upon his guard before him, these appeared to him no more than blemishes in a good character, which his goodness made him overlook, and his wisdom prevented him from discovering to the captain. Himself, very different would have been his sentiments, had he discovered the whole, which perhaps would, in time, have been the case, had the husband and wife long continued this kind of behavior to each other. But this kind fortune took effectual means to prevent by forcing the captain to do that which rendered him again dear to his wife and restored all her tenderness and affection towards him. The captain was made large amends for the unpleasant minutes which he passed in the conversation of his wife, and which were as few as he could contrive to make them by the pleasant meditations he enjoyed when alone. These meditations were entirely employed on Mr. Allworthy's fortune, for first, he exercised much thought in calculating, as well as he could, the exact value of the whole, which calculations he often saw occasion to alter in his own favor, and secondly, and chiefly, he pleased himself with intent in the house and gardens, and in projecting many other schemes, as well for the improvement of the estate as of the grandeur of the place. For this purpose, he applied himself to the studies of architecture and gardening, and read over many books on both these subjects. For these sciences indeed employed his whole time, and formed his only amusement. He at last completed a most excellent plan, and very sorry we are that it is not in our power to present it to our reader, since even the luxury of the present age, I believe, would hardly match it. It had, indeed, in a superlative degree, the two principal ingredients which serve to recommend all great and noble designs of this nature, for it required an immoderate expense to execute, and a vast length of time to bring it to any sort of perfection. The former of these, the immense wealth of which the captain supposed Mr. Allworthy possessed, and which he thought himself sure of inheriting, promised very effectually to supply, and the latter, the soundness of his own constitution and his time of life, which was only what is called middle age, removed all apprehension of his not living to accomplish. Nothing was wanting to enable him to enter upon the immediate execution of this plan, but the death of Mr. Allworthy, in calculating which he had employed much of his own algebra, besides purchasing every book extant that treats of the value of lives, reversions, and sea, from all which he satisfied himself that as he had every day a chance of this happening, so had he more than an even chance of its happening within a few years. But while the captain was one day busied in deep contemplations of this kind, one of the most unlucky as well as unseasonable accidents happened to him. The utmost malice of fortune could indeed have contrived nothing so cruel, so mal-apropos, so absolutely destructive to all his schemes. In short, not to keep the reader in long suspense just at the very instant when his heart was exulting in meditations on the happiness which would accrue to him by Mr. Allworthy's death, he himself died of an apoplexy. This unfortunately befell the captain as he was taking his evening walk by himself, so that nobody was present to lend him any assistance, if indeed any assistance could have preserved him. He took therefore measure of that proportion of soil which was now become adequate to all his future purposes, and he lay dead on the ground, a great, though not a living example of the truth of that observation of Horace tu secanda marmora, loca sub ipsum funus, et sepulchri immemor strui domos. Which sentiment I shall thus give to the English reader: you provide the noblest materials for building when a pickaxe and a spade are only necessary, and build houses of 500 by 100 feet, forgetting that of 6 by 2. Though the captain had effectually demolished poor Partridge, reducing him to a broken man stripped of livelihood and reputation, yet he had not reaped the golden harvest he so ardently hoped for, which was to turn the innocent foundling out of Mr. Allworthy's house. The victory felt hollow, the taste of ashes in his mouth. On the contrary, in a turn of events that galled the captain to his very core, that benevolent gentleman grew every day fonder of little Tommy. It was as if he intended to counterbalance his severity to the supposed father with a redoubled and extraordinary fondness and affection towards the son, showering upon the child the protection that had been withdrawn from the man. Each caress given to the boy was in the captain's jealous eye a jewel stolen from his own future inheritance. This perverse outcome a good deal soured the captain's already vinegar temperament, as did all the other daily instances of Mr. Allworthy's boundless generosity to the poor and distressed of the parish, for he looked on all such charitable largesses to be direct and personal diminutions of his own future wealth. Every shilling given away was a shilling plucked from the purse he already considered his own. In this miserly perspective we have said he did not agree with his wife, nor indeed did they agree in anything else. Theirs was a union of profound dissonance. For though an affection placed on the understanding is by many wise persons thought more durable than that which is founded merely on fleeting beauty, yet it happened quite otherwise in the present case. Nay, the very understandings of this couple, their intellects and opinions, became their principal bone of contention, and one great cause of the many quarrels which from time to time arose between them like poisonous weeds in a neglected garden. These conflicts at last ended on the side of the lady in a sovereign contempt for her husband's character, and on the husband's side in an utter abhorrence of his wife's very presence, as these two had both exercised their talents chiefly in the study of divinity. This was from their first acquaintance the most common topic of conversation between them. The captain, like a well-bred man playing a long game, had before marriage always given up his opinion to that of the lady. This surrender was not executed in the clumsy, awkward manner of a conceited blockhead who, while he civilly yields to a superior in an argument, is desirous of being still known to think himself in the right. The captain, on the contrary, though one of the proudest fellows in the world, so absolutely and seamlessly yielded the victory to his antagonist, that she, who had not the least doubt of his sincerity, retired always from the dispute with a glowing admiration of her own understanding and a confirmed love for his apparent reasonableness. But though this complaisance to one whom the captain thoroughly despised was not so uneasy to him as it would have been had any hopes of preferment made it necessary to show the same submission to a Hoadley or to some other divine of great reputation in the science. Yet even this charade cost him too much to be endured without some powerful motive. Matrimony, therefore, having removed all such motives, the mask slipped. He grew weary of this condescension and began to treat the opinions of his wife with that haughtiness and insolence which none but those who deserve some contempt themselves can bestow, and those only who deserve no contempt can bear. When the first torrent of marital tenderness had evaporated, and when, in the calm and long interval between the fits of passion, reason began to open the eyes of the lady, she saw this stark alteration of behavior in the captain. He who had once hung on her every word now answered all her carefully constructed arguments only with a dismissive pish and an impatient pshaw. She was far from enduring this indignity with a tame submission. Indeed, it at first so highly provoked her fiery spirit that it might have produced some tragical event had it not taken a more harmless turn by filling her with the utmost contempt for her husband's understanding. This contempt somewhat qualified her seething hatred towards him, though of this destructive emotion she still possessed a pretty moderate share. The captain's hatred to her was of a purer, more unadulterated kind. He did not despise her for her intellectual imperfections any more than he would have despised her for not being 6 feet high. In his opinion of the female sex, he exceeded the moroseness of Aristotle himself. He looked on a woman as on an animal of domestic use of somewhat higher consideration than a cat, since her offices were of rather more importance. But the difference between these two was in his estimation so small that in the marriage he had really contracted with Mr. Allworthy's lands and tenements, it would have been pretty equal which of them he had taken into the bargain. And yet, so tender was his pride that it acutely felt the contempt which his wife now began to express towards him. This, added to the surfeit he had before taken of her cloying love, created in him a degree of disgust and abhorrence perhaps hardly to be exceeded. Asterisk. Is there a relationship in literature you love to hate? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more character deep dives. Asterisk. There is but one situation of the married state that is utterly excluded from pleasure, and that is a state of pure indifference. But as many of my readers, I hope, know what an exquisite delight there is in conveying pleasure to a beloved object, so some few, I am afraid, may have experienced the darker satisfaction of tormenting one we hate. It is, I apprehend, to come at this latter more sinister pleasure that we see both sexes often give up that ease in marriage which they might otherwise possess, even though their mate was never so disagreeable to them. Hence the wife often puts on fits of love and jealousy, nay, even denies herself any pleasure, purely to disturb and prevent those of her husband. He again, in return, puts frequent restraints on himself, and stays at home in company which he dislikes intensely, in order to confine his wife to what she equally detests. Hence too must flow those tears which a widow sometimes so plentifully sheds over the ashes of a husband with whom she led a life of constant disquiet and turbulency, and whom now she can never hope to torment any more. But if ever any couple enjoyed this bitter, twisted pleasure, it was at present experienced by the captain and his lady. It was always a sufficient reason to either of them to be obstinate in any opinion that the other had previously asserted the contrary. If the one proposed any amusement, the other constantly objected to it with automatic reflex. They never loved or hated, commended or abused the same person, and for this very reason, as the captain looked with an evil and jealous eye on the little foundling, his wife began now to caress it, almost equally with her own child, an act of spite disguised as affection. The reader will be apt to conceive that this behavior between the husband and wife did not greatly contribute to Mr. Allworthy's repose. It tended so little to that serene happiness which he had designed for all three from this alliance. But the truth is, though he might be a little disappointed in his sanguine expectations, yet he was far from being acquainted with the whole ugly matter. The captain was from certain obvious reasons much on his guard before him, and the lady was obliged for fear of her brother's displeasure to pursue the same conduct. In fact, it is possible for a third person to be very intimate, nay, even to live long in the same house, with a married couple who have any tolerable discretion and not even guess at the sour sentiments which they bear to each other. Though the whole day may be sometimes too short for hatred as well as for love, yet the many hours which they naturally spend together apart from all observers furnish people of tolerable moderation with such ample opportunity for the enjoyment of either passion, that if they love they can support being a few hours in company without toying, or if they hate without spitting in each other's faces. It is possible, however, that Mr. Allworthy saw enough to render him a little uneasy, for we are not always to conclude that a wise man is not hurt because he doth not cry out and lament himself like those of a childish or effeminate temper. But indeed, it is possible he might see some faults in the captain without any profound uneasiness at all. Men of true wisdom and goodness are contented to take persons and things as they are, without complaining of their imperfections or attempting to amend them with a heavy hand. They can see a fault in a friend, a relation, or an acquaintance without ever mentioning it to the parties themselves or to any others. This often occurs without lessening their affection in the slightest. Indeed, unless great discernment be tempered with this overlooking disposition, we ought never to contract friendship, but with a degree of folly which we can easily deceive ourselves about. I hope my friends will pardon me when I declare I know none of them without a fault. I should be sorry if I could imagine I had any friend who could not see mine. Forgiveness of this kind we give and demand in turn. It is an exercise of friendship, and perhaps none of the least pleasant. This forgiveness we must bestow without a constant desire of amendment. There is perhaps no surer mark of folly than an attempt to correct the natural infirmities of those we love. The finest composition of human nature, as well as the finest china, may have a flaw in it. This, I am afraid, in either case is equally incurable, though nevertheless the pattern may remain of the highest value. Upon the whole, then, Mr. Allworthy certainly saw some imperfections in the captain. The man was not a perfect screen, and could not always hide his true nature. But as this was a very artful man and eternally upon his guard before him, these imperfections appeared to Allworthy no more than minor blemishes in a fundamentally good character. His goodness made him overlook them, and his wisdom prevented him from discovering them to the captain himself in a way that would cause humiliation. Very different would have been his sentiments had he discovered the whole rancid truth. This discovery, perhaps, would in time have been the case, had the husband and wife long continued this kind of behavior to each other, for secrets of such magnitude are rarely kept forever. But this kind fortune took effectual means to prevent, by forcing the captain to do that which rendered him again dear to his wife, and restored all her tenderness and affection towards him in the most final way imaginable. The captain was made large amends for the unpleasant minutes which he passed in the conversation of his wife, minutes which were as few as he could contrive to make them by the pleasant meditations he enjoyed when alone. These solitary hours were his true kingdom. These meditations were entirely employed on Mr. Allworthy's fortune, a subject upon which he could dwell with the rapt attention of a poet contemplating his muse. First, he exercised much thought in calculating as well as he could the exact value of the whole. These calculations he often saw occasion to alter in his own favor, the figures growing more generous with each passing day. Secondly, and chiefly, he pleased himself with designing intricate alterations in the house and gardens, and in projecting many other splendid schemes as well, for the improvement of the estate as of the grandeur of the place. In his mind's eye he demolished old walls, raised new pavilions, and laid out parterres that would put Versailles to shame. For this purpose he applied himself to the studies of architecture and gardening with the fervor of a scholar, and read over many books on both these subjects. These sciences indeed employed his whole time and formed his only amusement. He was like a spider, spinning a vast and intricate web of plans from the substance of his own ambition. He at last completed a most excellent and comprehensive plan. Very sorry we are that it is not in our power to present it to our reader, since even the luxury of the present age, I believe, would hardly match its audacious scale. It had indeed in a superlative degree the two principal ingredients which serve to recommend all great and noble designs of this nature, for it required an immoderate expense to execute, and a vast length of time to bring it to any sort of perfection. The former of these, the immense wealth of which the captain supposed Mr. Allworthy possessed, and which he thought himself sure of inheriting, promised very effectually to supply. The latter, the soundness of his own constitution and his time of life, which was only what is called middle age, removed all apprehension of his not living to accomplish it. He saw a long, prosperous future stretching out before him, a future where he was the master of Paradise Hall in fact, as well as in fancy. Nothing was wanting to enable him to enter upon the immediate execution of this plan but the death of Mr. Allworthy. In calculating this event, he had employed much of his own algebra, besides purchasing every book extant that treats of the value of lives, reversions, and sea, from all which he had satisfied himself that, as he had every day a chance of this happening, so had he more than an even chance of its happening within a few years. He awaited this event, not with ghoulish anticipation, but with the calm certainty of a mathematician awaiting the solution to a proven equation. Asterisk, asterisk. The captain's schemes are reaching their peak. What dramatic turn do you foresee? Subscribe and share to follow the unfolding of this masterfully woven plot. Asterisk, asterisk. But while the captain was one day busied in deep contemplations of this kind, one of the most unlucky as well as unseasonable accidents happened to him. The utmost malice of fortune could indeed have contrived nothing so cruel, so times mal apropos, times so absolutely destructive to all his schemes. In short, not to keep the reader in long suspense just at the very instant when his heart was exulting in meditations on the happiness which would accrue to him by Mr. Allworthy's death, he himself died of an apoplexy. This unfortunately befell the captain as he was taking his evening walk by himself, so that nobody was present to lend him any assistance, if indeed any assistance could have preserved him. He took therefore measure of that proportion of soil which was now become adequate to all his future purposes, and he lay dead on the ground, a great, though not a living example of the truth of that observation of Horace. Tu secunda marmora locas sub ipsum funus, et sepulchri immemor struidomos. Which sentiment I shall thus give to the English reader: you provide the noblest materials for building when a pickaxe and a spade are only necessary, and build houses of 500 by 100 feet, forgetting that of 6 by 2. Thus ended the captain, a man who had built castles in the air only to be granted a plot of earth 6 feet long. The evening had drawn its serene and star-dusted cloak over the countryside, and within the grand walls of Paradise Hall Mr. Allworthy, his sister, and another lady of their intimate acquaintance were assembled at the accustomed hour in the supper room. The fire crackled a cheerful accompaniment to the silent ticking of the clock, but as the minutes stretched into a considerable time, longer than usual, a faint shadow of anxiety began to creep into the comfortable room. Mr. Allworthy first declared he began to grow uneasy at the captain's stay, for he was a man most military in his punctuality at meals, a clockwork regularity that made his absence feel like a skipped beat in the heart of the household. With growing concern he gave orders that the great bell should be rung without the doors, its brazen voice calling out across the darkening grounds, and especially towards those shaded walks which the captain was wont to use for his evening meditations. All these summons proving ineffectual for the captain, had by a perverse and ironic accident betaken himself to a new walk that evening, a path his thoughts had never before trod. Mrs. Blifil declared she was seriously frightened. Her voice, usually so controlled, held a tremor that was not entirely feigned. Upon this, the other lady, who was one of her most intimate acquaintances, and who well knew the true barren state of her affections, endeavored all she could to pacify her, weaving a tapestry of comforting possibilities, telling her to be sure she could not help being uneasy, but that she should hope the best, that perhaps the enchanting sweetness of the evening had enticed the captain to go farther than his usual walk, lured by the scent of honeysuckle and the whisper of the night breeze, or he might be detained at some neighbor's hearth, engaged in a conversation too stimulating to break. Mrs. Blifil answered no. She was sure some accident had befallen him, for that he would never stay out without sending her word, as he must know how terribly uneasy it would make her. The other lady, having no other arguments to use, betook herself to the entreaties usual on such occasions, and begged her not to frighten herself, for it might be of very ill consequence to her own delicate health, and filling out a very large glass of ruby-colored wine advised, and at last, with gentle persistence, prevailed with her to drink it, a temporary dam against her rising distress. Mr. Allworthy now returned into the parlour, his own brow furrowed with a concern that was simple and genuine, for he had been himself out in the growing dusk searching after the captain. His countenance, usually so placid sufficiently, showed the consternation he was under, which indeed had for a moment quite deprived him of speech. But as grief operates variously on different minds, so the same apprehension which depressed his voice elevated that of Mrs. Blifil to a theatrical pitch. She now began to bewail herself in very bitter and loud terms, and floods of tears accompanied her lamentations, a performance of wifely duty. The lady, her companion, declared she could not blame such a natural outburst, but at the same time earnestly dissuaded her from indulging it too deeply. She attempted to moderate the grief of her friend by philosophical observations on the many disappointments to which human life is daily subject, which she said was a sufficient consideration to fortify our minds against any accidents, however sudden or terrible. She said her brother's own calm example ought to teach her patience, who, though indeed he could not be supposed as much concerned as herself, yet was doubtless very uneasy, though his pious resignation to the divine will had restrained his grief within due and manly bounds. "Mention not, my brother," cried Mrs. Blifil, with a fresh wave of sorrow. "I alone am the true object of your pity. What are the cold terrors of friendship to what a wife feels on these occasions? Oh, he is lost. Somebody hath murdered him. I shall never see him more." Here a torrent of tears, real enough in their physical manifestation, had the same consequence that the suppression of emotion had occasioned in Mr. Allworthy, and she remained silent, the picture of devastated wifely love. At this tense interval, a servant came running into the room, his face pale, and his breath coming in short gasps, and cried out, "The captain was found," and before he could proceed farther, he was followed by two more sturdy footmen bearing the too heavy, lifeless body between them, a stark and silent answer to all their fears. Here the curious reader may observe another fascinating diversity in the operations of grief. For, as Mr. Allworthy had been before silent from the shock that now made his sister vociferous, so did the present sight, which drew genuine tears of compassion from the gentleman, put an entire and sudden stop to those of the lady. She first gave a violent piercing scream that rattled the window panes, and presently after fell into a fit, sinking into the arms of her companion in a graceful swoon. The room was soon a chaos of hushed voices and hurried footsteps, full of servants summoned by the commotion, some of whom, with the lady visitant, were immediately employed in the care of the wife, loosening her stays, applying smelling salts, and fanning her pallid face. Others, under Mr. Allworthy's quiet, grief-stricken direction, assisted in carrying the captain's mortal remains to a warm bed, where every method was tried with a desperate and hopeful energy in order to restore him to life. They rubbed his cold limbs, held strong spirits to his nostrils, and called his name into the unhearing silence. And glad should we be, could we inform the reader that both these bodies had been attended with equal success. Those who undertook the care of the lady succeeded admirably well, for after the fit had continued a decent and dramatically appropriate time, she again revived to their great and vocal satisfaction. But as to the captain, all experiments of bleeding, chafing, dropping, and see proved utterly ineffectual. Death, that inexorable and final judge, had passed sentence on him and refused to grant him a reprieve, though two doctors who arrived in a shared carriage and were feed at one and the same instant pleaded as his counsel. These two doctors, whom to avoid any malicious applications we shall distinguish by the names of Dr. Y and Dr. Z, having felt his pulse, to wit, Dr. Y, his right arm, and Dr. Z, his left, like men, checking the time on two stopped clocks, both agreed that he was absolutely dead. But as to the distemper or cause of his death, they differed as fundamentally as two philosophers. Dr. Y, a man of solid and apoplectic build, himself held that he died of an apoplexy, a sudden rush of humours to the head. Dr. Z, who was of a more nervous disposition, diagnosed an epilepsy, a fierce rebellion of the spirits. Hence arose a spirited dispute between the learned men, in which each delivered the reasons for their several opinions with great erudition and conviction. These reasons were of such equal force and folly that they served only to confirm each doctor in his own original sentiments, and made not the least impression on his adversary, their minds being like fortified castles, impervious to the arrows of contrary evidence. Asterisk, asterisk, dramatic twists abound. Who do you think is the more cunning character in this tale of woe and pretense? Subscribe and share your insights in the comments. Asterisk, asterisk. To say the truth, every physician almost hath his favorite disease, a pet villain, to which he ascribes all the victories obtained over human nature. The gout, the rheumatism, the stone, the gravel, and the consumption have all their several patrons in the faculty, and none more than the nervous fever or the fever on the spirits. And here we may account for those learned disagreements in opinion concerning the cause of a patient's death, which sometimes occur between the most esteemed of the college, and which have greatly surprised that part of the world who have been ignorant of the fact we have above asserted. The reader may perhaps be surprised that instead of endeavoring to revive the patient, the learned gentleman should fall immediately into a dispute on the occasion of his death. But in reality, all such experiments had been made before their arrival. The captain had been put into a warm bed. His veins had been scarified, his forehead chafed raw, and all sorts of strong, pungent drops applied to his unfeeling lips and nostrils. The physicians, therefore, finding themselves anticipated in everything they might have ordered, were at a loss how to apply that portion of time which it is usual and decent to remain for their fee. They were therefore necessitated to find some subject or other for discourse to justify their attendance. And what could more naturally present itself than that before mentioned? Our doctors were about to take their leave, their professional duty to the corpse discharged, when Mr. Allworthy, having given over the captain to a higher power, and acquiesced in the divine will with a heavy heart, began to inquire after his sister. He desired them to visit her before their departure, for her fit had seemed to him a serious matter. This lady was now recovered from her fit, and to use the common phrase, was as well as could be expected for one in her delicate condition. The doctors, therefore, all previous ceremonies being complied with, and as this was a new living, and therefore billable patient, attended according to desire, they laid hold on each of her hands as they had before done on those of the corpse, their fingers seeking the narrative of life or death in the pulse. The case of the lady was in the other extreme from that of her husband, for, as he was past all the assistance of physic, so in reality she required none her ailment, being of a more strategic and social nature. There is nothing more unjust than the vulgar opinion by which physicians are misrepresented as friends to death. On the contrary, I believe if the number of those who recover by physic could be opposed to that of the martyrs to it, the former would rather exceed the latter. Nay, some are so cautiously committed to life that to avoid the slightest possibility of killing the patient, they abstain from all vigorous methods of curing and prescribe nothing but what can neither do good nor harm, mere placebos for the mind. I have heard some of these, with great gravity, deliver it as a maxim that nature should be left to do her own work, while the physician stands by, as it were, to clap her on the back and encourage her when she doth well. So little then did our doctors delight in death that they discharged the corpse after a single albeit shared fee. But they were not so disgusted with their living patient, concerning whose case they immediately agreed, sensing a profitable and prolonged engagement. They fell to prescribing, with great diligence, recommending rest, a light diet, soothing draughts, and above all perfect quiet, for the nerves had clearly sustained a terrible shock. Whether, as the lady had at first persuaded her physicians to believe her ill, they had now in return persuaded her to believe herself, so I will not determine, but she continued a whole month with all the decorations of sickness, receiving visitors from her curtained bed, her voice a frail thread. During this time she was visited by physicians, attended by nurses, and received constant messages from her acquaintance to inquire after her health, the very model of a grieving, delicate widow. Asterisk. If you're captivated by the intricate social dramas of the 18th century, be sure to like and share this chapter with a fellow literature lover. Asterisk. At length the decent time for sickness and immoderate grief being expired, the doctors were discharged with full pockets, and the lady began to see company again. She was altered only from what she was before by that colour of sadness in which she had dressed her person and countenance, a becoming veil of loss that she wore with elegant propriety. The captain was now interred in the quiet earth, and might perhaps have already made a large progress towards oblivion, had not the generous friendship of Mr. Allworthy taken care to preserve his memory. He commissioned the following epitaph, which was written by a man of as great genius as integrity, and one who, through the masterful application of tactful inquiry, perfectly well knew the public character of the captain. Thus, with the cold earth settled over Captain Blifil, a profound, if deceptive calm, descended upon Paradise Hall. The storm of passion and jealousy that had so characterized his brief tenure there was replaced by a quietude that Mr. Allworthy in his benevolent heart mistook for peace. For a time the household seemed to return to its former tranquil rhythm, its days marked by the gentle progression of the sun and the steadfast application of Christian charity. Yet the seeds of truth, though long buried, are tenacious things. They push relentlessly towards the light, and so it was that the full history of young Tom Jones, the little foundling upon whom so much affection and animosity had been lavished, began at last to unravel. The intricate web of deception so carefully spun by those who saw in his innocence a threat to their own avarice could not hold against the slow, inexorable pressure of facts. Through a series of revelations as dramatic as they were, undeniable revelations brought forth by the remorseful testimony of a dying woman and the steadfast loyalty of a once maligned schoolmaster, the noble birth of the child was made manifest. He was no bastard, but the secret offspring of a loving, if ill-fated union, placed in Allworthy's bed, not as an act of shame, but as a desperate plea for protection from a cruel and powerful family. The shock of this discovery was, for Mr. Allworthy, profound. It was not the shock of betrayal, but the staggering realization of his own fallibility, of how his own good nature had been manipulated to nearly disastrous ends. He saw with painful clarity the machinations of his sister Bridget, who in her own complex blend of maternal guilt and social ambition had conspired to conceal the truth. He saw the profound injustice done to Partridge, a man broken upon the wheel of a false confession and a wife's rage, and he saw the true character of young Master Blifil, his nephew, who had inherited his father's duplicity in full measure, and who had with cold calculation worked to poison his uncle's mind against the generous-hearted Tom. In the ensuing reordering of the world, justice, that grand and often elusive principle, was at last served. The scheming Master Blifil, his mask torn away, was cast out from Paradise Hall, his inheritance revoked and bestowed upon its rightful heir, Tom Jones, now acknowledged as a gentleman of birth and fortune, found his tumultuous path paved with youthful follies and a heart of unwavering goodness finally smoothed. His love for the beautiful and virtuous Sophia Weston, a love tested by distance, misunderstanding, and the machinations of others, was at last consecrated in a joyful union, a marriage of true minds that promised a lifetime of happiness. Mr. Allworthy, in his winter years, found a spring of contentment he had never known. To have his beloved Tom restored to him not only as a ward but as a kinsman, and to see in him the embodiment of every good principle he had ever cherished, was a reward beyond any his fortune could provide. He saw that benevolence is its own reward, and that while it may sometimes be deceived, it can never truly be defeated. And so, dear reader, we take our leave of this little world we have inhabited. We have witnessed vice punished and virtue rewarded. We have seen love triumph over calculation and honesty prevail over guile. The tapestry of their lives is now complete, its every thread accounted for. Let this history stand as a testament that though the road may be winding and the journey fraught with peril, a good heart guided by integrity and warmed by affection will in the end find its way home. The gates of Paradise Hall stand open not to the cunning or the cruel, but to the kind, and within its walls goodness and mercy have at last secured their everlasting dominion.